It's a pleasure to welcome you to our second Retail Food and Beverage Sector C19 Focus webinar. I'm David Tate, Marsh's Retail Food, Beverage and Leisure Industry Sector Leader, and will be hosting this session. Today, we focus on the opportunities and challenges leading retail and food firms face in keeping pace with the unprecedented demand swings created by the new consumer landscape. Your colleagues across essential industries are nothing less than heroines and heroes, supporting the country through this crisis. They are in the eye of the storm, facing risk when they interface with the public on the shop floor or on the doorstep, and through their interactions with colleagues within shops, distribution centres, or food manufacturing plants. We recognise there can be tension as you balance surges of demand on one side with an absolute focus on keeping your colleagues safe, well, motivated, and rewarded. It is right that we focus on supporting you to provide them with best advice as they deal with the myriad of opportunities and challenges created by C19. Moving on to our panelist slide. As advertised, we'll be leading with 4 topics today. The first, led by Darren Holmes, Marsh's Head of Operational Risk, will focus on employee protection, considering changes to the regulatory environment, measures to reduce employee risk, and also looking into product considerations. Our second topic will be led by Dr. Wolfgang Seidel, Workplace Health Consulting Leader within Marsh Mercer Benefits. Wolfgang will offer insights on employee assistance programs and the support services available to employees, including mental health strategies. Beth Thurston, our UK Management Liability Leader, will consider the implications C19 is having on directors' and officers' liability policies. And I will conclude with topic 4, providing an overview of general insurance considerations for key policies. The webinar is scheduled to last for 45 minutes. Our panelists will aim to conclude our overviews within 30 minutes, leaving 15 minutes for Q&A. I want to encourage you to submit questions you have through the WebEx portal. Questions will be covered towards the end of today's session. You can type your questions into the window at the bottom of your computer screen. And thank you to those of you who have submitted questions earlier in the week. We'll aim to answer as many as we can. If we can't get to your answer today, we'll get back to you soon with an answer. So, moving swiftly on, let's crack into our first topic, led by Darren Holmes.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome everybody, and appreciate you taking the time to join us. For employers and employees, the coronavirus pandemic continues to bring daily challenges as we work through navigating a dynamic and evolving situation. We're seeing daily changes to legislation, policy, procedures, guidance, and it's difficult to be able to keep on top of these. But I wanted to just spend just a minute just talking through some of the more recent changes that were notified in the last 7 days. The Health and Safety Executive have made some quite strong commitments and quite strong statements regarding their role and the impact of their role during this time. And whilst we've seen other organisations and lead bodies take perhaps a more relaxed view to some of the regulation and policy, the Health and Safety Executive have been quite strong in their approach, in which they will not see any relaxing of the rules or policies, procedures or the law. So some real key points just to pick out from this. We've seen some relevant RIDDOR changes. These include that an unintended incident at work has led to someone possibly or actual exposure to coronavirus. This must now be reported as a dangerous occurrence under the RIDDOR regulations. A worker has been diagnosed as having COVID-19 and there is reasonable evidence that it was caused by exposure of work. This is quite a difficult one to challenge because it's about reasonable evidence, but this needs to be reported as a case of disease. Or if a worker dies as a result of a work-related exposure to coronavirus, this must be reported as a fatality. I think what's challenging is actually interpreting these and trying to identify whether it was actually the workplace that led to the contracting of COVID-19 or whether it was contracted somewhere else. But if in doubt, I would certainly recommend that a conversation, phoning your local environmental health office or health and safety executive to seek some guidance about whether you should or shouldn't report. Another point I just really wanted to raise was around the enforcement position of the health and safety executive. They're suspending targeted inspection activity across the UK, so there'll be no regular inspections carried out, but they will also continue to investigate work-related deaths and most serious major injuries, dangerous occurrences and reported concerns. Again, this is difficult for the food and drink manufacturing industry where you continue to work and you continue to have employees. But in certain circumstances where you have a reduced workforce, certain policies and procedures do have a habit of slipping. So I would suggest that you just keep a focus on this and make sure that you do report things moving forward. Just jumping on to the next slide, I wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about some of the operational risk management considerations and some of the measures to reduce risk. So some of the strategic actions to protect against future claims, I think this is a really key point to consider. Make sure that you keep copies of guidance of everything issued to your organisation and to your employees. Make sure that any training that is provided is recorded and again held on file. And consult with your employees and their representatives where practical on their involvement and their application of any controls or processes that you put in place on the back of COVID-19. Review the Health and Safety Executive's website guidance on a regular basis. It literally is changing every day. So I would definitely recommend, and there is some good information on there with dealing with infections and keeping records and also about key decision-making processes and how you can keep ahead of that. It also links to public health guidelines as well. And keep these decisions under review. What you put in place today might not be relevant tomorrow, so make sure that you keep it reviewed and keep it up to date, and make sure that you inform your employees of any changes that you do make. And also appoint an individual or team to help keep abreast of developments. It's good practice to actually build a team out within your team. It doesn't need to, does it within your business, it doesn't need to be a huge team, but just focusing and coordinating all of the information that's feeding through to make sure that updates and advice from the regulators and the health and safety executive and government, etc., are communicated across. Also, I wanted to just touch on evidencing risk assessment. Exposure through close contact with carriers, access and egress from site, making sure that you maintain 2-metre rule. It's still applicable. Social distances is still in place. Difficult in a food and drink manufacturing environment. I fully appreciate that. But through the risk assessment process, it's good practice just to consider how you can maintain that to the best sort of your ability. Also thinking about break times in restaurants or cafeterias, making sure that people are sort of moving tables further apart, etc., encouraging people not to sit in large groups of people. Also thinking about lone working, vulnerable workers. I would definitely suggest that you link in with your HR team, particularly if you have occupational health practices or you have an occupational health practitioner, identifying vulnerable workers and making sure that your controls are suitable for those vulnerable workers as well. Mental health and well-being has hit the headlines quite a lot over the last few months since this started, and my colleague Dr. Wolfgang will talk about that in more detail as we go forward. And also document how much you have implemented controls measures such as sanitation and social distancing. CCTV photographs could be vital here, so make sure that those systems are still working. Some of the additional controls that you might want to consider is organisations where work continues will need to revise and offer clear first aid guidance. So this is first aid guidance of dealing with somebody who may have injured themselves, and this may involve the issue of additional personal protective equipment such as face masks. So ensure that you have enough supplies of those for your first aiders, and also policies and procedures to help the first aiders understand what they need to do to apply it. Identify your vulnerable categories. This may be due to age, underlying health conditions, or as defined in legislation such as pregnant workers. And again, just linking back to the point before, making sure that you're documenting this through risk assessment. Employees should be asked to report any symptoms of them or others in their household, as they may bring the virus into the workplace. So keep a close eye on that, and have a process for them to alert managers, supervisors, etc. in the workplace, and also take a record of that conversation that was had. Things such as a high temperature means you feel hot to touch your chest or back. You don't need to measure temperature with a thermometer or infrared measuring device. Simply, you know, if people feel that they have a high temperature, then this might be indication that they have contracted at some level COVID-19, or a new and continuous cough as provided by Public Health England. And enforcement, make sure line managers need to be made aware of new ways of working, including PPE, and ensure that these are adhered to. I certainly would recommend that this is documented and some form of inspection is put in place in case that in the future that you need to be able to provide some form of defence should something turn into a claim. Just moving on to my final slide, I wanted to just touch on some of the product considerations and what the impact of a number of areas. So thinking around, particularly in relation to your risk assessment, thinking about reducing face-to-face handovers. It might be suitable to be able to do that by telephone. It might even be that you use a notepad as a handover document. But thinking about this in terms of risk assessment, is this increasing any risk of contamination where you're trying to maintain social distancing? Loss of key personnel due to the virus. Who is in charge of the head of quality food safety cannot be contacted, so making sure that you've got processes and procedures in place to be able to contact other people should they be off work. And who will be brought into the crisis management team if employees are unavailable. So really reviewing your crisis management plan, particularly if you're in continuous process manufacturing. Changing where you sit in the supply chain. Is your brand now more visible to consumers? Have you changed from making one item to another item, such as we've seen a lot of companies move into the manufacturing of hand sanitizer, for example? Does this create more visibility to consumers? So considering the risks around that. And having to close facilities, are you now at increased risk of malicious product tampering, particularly if you're condensing activities down into individual sites and closing some of your more satellite or remote sites? Has a reduced workforce, has this resulted in longer production runs, less cleaning? Does this increase the risk? And if so, what controls are in place? And are you having to use alternative suppliers, and have these been audited? And have you got documented evidence of this and kept records of it? And my final point was really about increased sales. Have you got more product in the market and therefore more exposure in the event of contamination? Certainly, I would be looking back at your product recall policy, your product recall procedures, to make sure that they're able to adapt to be able to respond to these should an event occur. And what would a business interruption loss look like now if you couldn't get your product to market due to a contamination? So again, just reviewing where you're currently sitting, both financially, policy, procedures, and people. And they're the real key points that we would sort of suggest that you consider where you are doing continuous manufacturing in this process. There's a lot of information that's available. The grocer provides some really good information on supply chain. So certainly would point you towards those sites, because they do provide some really good updated information. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Dr. Wolfgang, to talk around some of the workplace health issues.
Can people hear me? Yeah, thank you very much, Darren. Always a pleasure listening to you and your very precise advice. Good morning to everybody online, and thank you for joining the discussion. If I could have the first slide, please. I think that slide is just reminding us that we are all very clear that we are living in a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world right now. And I've been asked to talk a bit about the mental health impact of the current situation, because psychiatry is my background. And as we are living through the acute phase of the pandemic right now, we are talking about immediate psychological needs and business continuity, and as Darren just did, about our crisis response. But now is also the time to start thinking about phase 2, when we will come out of lockdown, and the need, some of us, many of your employees, of course, are not in lockdown, and the need to put our crisis response in context of a more strategic approach to health and well-being. Let me frame it in that psychological way of saying that, psychologically speaking, let's not forget that we all respond differently to similar challenges. We all interpret threats in personal ways. So there's no right or wrong. And we shouldn't assume that our colleagues are looking at the COVID-19 pandemic in the same way as we do. So managers are very well advised to first of all listen and relate with empathy. Let's be mindful that some colleagues have anxiety issues during normal times that can be exacerbated during a crisis, particularly if someone suffers from, say, generalized anxiety disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. This will definitely be exacerbated now as everyone is looking to get some control back into their lives. So line managers need to properly acknowledge employees' concerns, listen, and when appropriate, suggest a conversation with the EAP. What is an EAP? It's a 24/7 helpline. And looking at this slide, you see immediately that the EAP can play a key part among your benefits in the current situation. The counseling helpline is the first port of call for anxiety issues just discussed, or depression due to loneliness for some, and so on. For those working from home, we also need to think about domestic violence. Again, the EAP is relevant in that context. It can also provide guidance in financial and legal matters. So that's not advice, but guidance, to name but two more presenting problems highly relevant in the current situation. And I would suggest that now is a good time to get reacquainted with your EAP, as we have reached a critical phase in the pandemic, and it is sadly just a matter of time until someone in your team may become seriously ill or die. And in this case, you need something called critical incident services, which EAPs provide, and you can see on the next slide, which is, if you like, the people continuity aspect of business continuity planning and crisis management that Darren also talked about. I mean, I served years on a global panel of experts for disaster management in the workplace, and we always told organizations, as you can see on this chart, that the preparedness phase is the most important one. We need to line up the right psychological response when there is an accident, a terrorist attack, a staff suicide, or specifically now a pandemic, or death in service as a consequence. But we also need to clarify communication policies, as you all do, like who speaks to the press, as it's human nature to see issues differently. And if colleagues give interviews who are not media trained, we often face a public relations disaster on top of a human crisis, whatever it is that the media is interested in and your colleagues want to convey. In the response phase, we need interventions that are evidence-based, following NICE guidelines. Not all EAPs do it in the right way. And in phase 3, similarly, we need to screen for post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, not all counselors know how to do that. But moving on to the next slide, it is just important, as I mentioned earlier, that once we are coming out on the other side of this crisis, when the pandemic subsides, that organizations will urgently review their health and well-being strategies, as our global surveys clearly show. Those organizations that have good programs in place found it easier to deploy the right resources in the current crisis, not least because they have good health pathways in place. And the slide in front of you shows you the health challenges retailers deal with throughout the year. What stands out here is the higher than average productivity loss due to ill health, as measured by this survey called Britain's Healthiest Workplace, and data is mined by Rand Europe and Cambridge University, just to give it the necessary credibility in our discussion today. Productivity loss due to ill health is 43 days on average versus 35 days in terms of the average of the study. Financial worries also stand out a bit, 13.6% versus 9%. Sleep deprivation and mental health conditions, again, nearly 12% versus 8.3% on average in the study. Weight issues and physical activity also pose a challenge in your environment. I'm talking now, of course, about the general context of health and well-being that we will soon be facing up to again and trying to create strategies around. And how do we do that? So on the next slide that I call data-driven analysis and strategy, we can see that in addition to the health risk data that I just discussed with you, there is also a number of hard data sets from insured and uninsured health-related benefits, such as medical plans, absence data, long-term disability or income protection, and so forth, depending on what you have. EAP data, of course, as well, occupational health data, and anything else that's relevant here. So to avoid a one-sided health and well-being strategy, it's necessary to cross-reference all available data sets that you can see in this dashboard example. So not going into that in much more detail, but I want to address on my last slide the so what question. So once we know where the problems are, and we have just established via the data from Britain's Healthiest Workplace that mental health is a big issue in the retail industry, we can then create health pathways that have a measurable impact. So the mental health pathway case study in front of you, for instance, reduced the number of claims by 9%, average cost of claims by 16%, and most importantly, improved therapy outcomes by 60%. And we do face now an avalanche of mental health issues, as I mentioned earlier. So just to hand over in time, I would like to summarize that empathy was a word you heard me use several times, and that's really important because it's not just important to show the caring face of your organization during the crisis, but it's also important for business success and the way how your colleagues look after your clients. And it has been said before that if you look after your people first, then they will take care of your clients. Thank you for listening to that part, and I'm handing over now to Beth.
Thanks, Wolfgang. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 from a DNO perspective. But before I do that, I just need to set the scene as to what has been happening in the DNO market in recent months. So Rob, if you can flick to my first slide, please. So those of you who have had any dealings in DNO insurance will no doubt understand that the market is very challenging. Following an initial transitioning in 2018, the market deterioration really accelerated through 2019 and particularly in the second half of that year. We have seen both significant rate movement and ongoing capacity contraction in the DNO marketplace, such that on average for clients in the retail sector, they saw a 123% increase in premiums in Q4 of 2019. At that time, insurers had concerns regarding the challenges being faced by the retail sector, particularly around financial stability and the potential for DNO claims arising from that. That market deterioration continued in the first quarter of 2020, even before the development of COVID-19. Our preliminary data suggests that year-on-year premium increases of in excess of 150% will be seen for the renewals that took place in Q1 of this year. So the DNO market was already showing signs of being highly sensitized both to negative news and also were very selective on business sectors well before the emergence of COVID-19 as a phenomenon. The pandemic has only increased insurers' concerns regarding the retail sector generally, with a heightened focus on financial stability and the likely future impact of the pandemic. The insurer response in London was immediate. We saw an increased underwriting focus. So for those of you with a listed entity, gone are the days when DNO underwriters would just rely on publicly available information, we have seen multiple requests for detailed specific information, and we also very quickly saw an increased attention to the applicable terms and conditions on each of those DNO policies. And then on the next slide, I have tried to indicate areas where you can work to navigate the challenges that you were already seeing in the DNO marketplace and which have now been exacerbated by the current position. Frankly, and most importantly, you need to start the renewal process early from a DNO perspective. You need to understand from your broker what the key concerns of insurers are likely to be, and they will be different for each of you. And you'll need to provide as much detail as you can to deal with those concerns. Insurers will want to understand your preparedness for the pandemic, how you have managed your staff, and how you are continuing to transact business, if indeed you are continuing to transact business at this time. They'll want to understand your internal controls and procedures. And where appropriate, you should engage the C-suite so that they can interact with key insurers individually and respond to the concerns that they will undoubtedly raise. You may need to consider the structure of the programme that you have historically purchased, the limit that you currently purchase, and also consider alternative options for the programme that you currently place. When you do get to the stage of considering the renewal terms, there are 3 specific things that you will need to be mindful of in relation to COVID-19. Firstly, there may currently be a bodily injury exclusion on your DNO policy. If there is, it's likely to be narrowly drafted such that only claims for bodily injury, not including mental anguish, will be excluded. So any attempt to expand that exclusion should be resisted. Secondly, we saw an initial reaction from DNO insurers, with some considering the application of a specific COVID-19 pandemic exclusion for DNO. Some of the language that we saw in recent weeks was incredibly broad, such that, if accepted, it had the potential to exclude claims that had any connection with COVID-19. So following significant pressure, both from Marsh and the wider broking community, at this stage, with one exception, we now have clarity from insurers that they're not looking to apply COVID-19 exclusions across the board, but they may look to do so on specific risks. So you must be vigilant and ensure that if there is a suggestion of its use, then the narrowest possible language is used. So rather than an absolute exclusion, we should be pushing for language. And then thirdly, you need to consider the position in the event that there is an insolvency situation. What is the current position under the DNO policy? Some of the broadest policies that our clients currently have will contain an automatic discovery period for claims following an insolvency with no additional premium payable. But we are now seeing the market remove those provisions where they've previously been applied. So what happens in the worst case scenario? How do you ensure ongoing cover for the senior executives in your organisation? The policy will likely continue to expiry, and you will need to understand what will happen in the scenario post expiry of the current policy. Is there an automatic runoff provision? If not, or if there is, how will that runoff be triggered? What is the cost of the runoff so that your senior executives are covered for future claims post expiry of the current policy? And how can that cost be funded going forward? Above all, I think the message is that you need to be prepared, understand and prepare for the challenges that you will face at renewal which are now more extreme than many of you have faced over the last 18 months in the DNO landscape. Where possible, do whatever you can to future-proof the programme and consider carefully the exclusionary language that I've referred to. Now, I'm mindful of time, and so I'm going to pass back over to David, who will conclude with his comments.
Thank you, Beth. Now looking at the implications C19 is having on what I would call general policies, I think at the macro programme structure level, businesses need to consider several things. And firstly, looking at programme limits. Are they adequate? For example, are property or business interruption limits adequate if stock levels are increasing significantly, or if increased production levels or trading volumes lead to the need to review business interruption limits? These changes could also impact the estimated maximum loss values you have at your target locations. Similar considerations could also apply to marine and transit policies. And from a liability perspective, do increased employee numbers lead to the need to review employers' liability policy limits? Regarding retentions, again, do they need to be reviewed? For example, are policy aggregates adequate? Do they need to be increased or decreased to reflect business activity? And this will also have a knock-on effect on funding and potentially change collateral requirements too. From a policy protection perspective, it could be worth, for example, reviewing supplier extensions in light of likely supply chain changes. We've also seen requests for contingent protection in the event that landlord buildings insurance is invalidated through failure to comply with unoccupied premises conditions. There may also be a need to look at policy declarations and adjustments in light of either significant increases or decreases in values, sendings turnover, or wage roll. And Darren mentioned this earlier, changes to business activities may necessitate disclosure to insurers, and we would always advocate close collaboration with your insurance partners so they're fully aware of changes to your business. For example, rapid business expansion could lead to changes in colleague onboarding processes, health checks, and training. So keeping insurers appraised of such changes is really important. And finally, as businesses change rapidly, we're also recommending ensuring your whole policy portfolio is aligned and keeps aligned with your risk profile, which has no doubt changed due to C19. So that was concluding the panelist section. Moving into the Q&A section, and first question I think I'm going to throw over to Darren. First question: where it's not possible to maintain social distancing 2 meters in a manufacturing plant other than screens to physically separate workers, are there other measures which should be implemented?
That's a really great question. Thank you, David. Yes, there are some things that you need to consider. I think first of all, I would point you towards the use of face masks in the manufacturing environment. Now, this might be quite challenging, particularly where individuals are required to wear beard snoods. So the interaction of certain personal protective equipment can be a challenge in itself. So I certainly would recommend that a risk assessment is carried out before you do use face masks. But also thinking about the level of risk. A beard snood is about protecting your consumers from contamination of product. The face mask is protecting the individual and the person working close to them from potentially contracting COVID-19. So look at it from a risk assessment perspective and weigh up the pros and cons of introducing that. I'd also suggest regular changing of protective wear. So whilst this will have an increased cost of manufacture, but making sure regular changes of coats, gloves, etc., I think is really key. Providing guidance, such as do not turn to speak face to face if someone is talking to you. That might seem a little bit strange thing to ask of people, but it is about mitigating and minimizing risk. Where people are coughing and sneezing, guidance telling people to try and leave the actual area of work so they're not coughing near people. And where they do, they're actually going away and washing their hands and, if necessary, changing their coats. But be mindful of other people. I think that's probably the key message. Other things to consider is signage. So using signage where people are walking into production areas, just a simple thing on the wall, just reminding people to try and keep the distance where possible, and where they can't, then try not to talk to people face to face. That might seem rude, but as I say, it's about trying to mitigate the risk of exposure. And the other thing I would say is about encourage reporting pre-shift. So this is about where people are coming in, perhaps at the clocking in area, perhaps sign up saying, you know, if you have been suffering from any of the conditions associated with COVID-19, such as increased coughing, or you are feeling a little bit under the weather, etc., then these should be reported. Underlying all of this, it's about documenting everything, where you put these things in place, where you have signage put up, where you do additional training on procedures and processes to follow during production for production workers. Make sure that you document those conversations. It's not necessarily needed that every single person signs to say that they've received it, but it might be just a simple toolbox talk that's done sort of 5 minutes, and do it frequently and keep people up to date, and remind them of those controls.
Thank you, Dan. Next question is Wolfgang. How are businesses changing their employee assistance programs in light of C-19?
A very interesting and good question, because, you know, employee assistance programs are often neglected where they are in place and have low utilization. Now we see the opposite, of course. People are very keen on using EAPs, and also those organizations who don't have EAPs feel that they are sort of left behind. Yet there are now many inquiries that we are also working on for clients who want a short-term solution, and those are available. So if you feel now that you want to look after your staff better in terms of discharging your duty of care by giving them access to helplines that are talking about anxiety issues, depression issues, but also give them the first basic information on financial well-being that also comes from EAPs. Very often, some of them even have insolvency practitioners on staff and other colleagues. Then you could inquire in terms of getting a short-term solution for a few months. Also, I'm cognizant of a lot of part-time workers in your industry. You may also want to consider covering them for a certain period of time as you are hiring to meet demand.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Beth, a question on DNO. What preventative action can be taken now to head off potential future DNO claims relating to C-19?
Thanks, David. That's not an easy question. Also, in addition to that question, David, I can see that a question has been posed that's related, that says, can I also comment on DNO lawsuits that have been initiated over the past number of weeks that are directly related to COVID-19, and whether or not any of those are related to the food, beverage and retail sectors. So I'll deal with both elements if I can. So first of all, in relation to the lawsuits that we have seen so far, those in the public domain, there are, as far as I'm aware, certainly 3 class actions that have been initiated in the US. I would say that 2 of them are directly related to COVID-19. 1 of them is not so directly related. None of those 3 are from the retail, beverage or food sectors. 1 is in the travel sector, 1 is in the pharmaceutical sector, and the other is in the technology sector. I think that there is a concern in relation to how steps that can be taken to seek to prevent or hold off such claims being brought. With the rise of event-driven litigation in recent years, I think that there is a concern that effectively any adverse impact on a company could lead to a claim. I think from a COVID-19 perspective, claims are likely to come from probably 3 different sectors. So there is a potential for claims to be brought by employees, perhaps alleging a form of discrimination. There is a potential for claims to be brought by customers in relation to preparedness for the situation that everybody is currently facing, and also the potential for shareholder claims in relation to stock price volatility. There is no easy answer to the question as how do you seek to prevent those claims being brought, but it really encapsulates the comments specifically that Darren has already referenced in some detail in relation to, first and foremost, following the government guidelines and the regulations in different jurisdictions, and ensuring, for example, that all employees are treated equally and fairly. So in the event that you are applying a different policy either for different jurisdictions or for different sectors of employees within your organisations, ensure that there is sound reasoning behind those decisions that are being made at senior management level, and that they are appropriately documented. And again, in relation to those of you that work in listed organisations, ensure that disclosures that you're giving are appropriate given the continually developing situation. You may also want to just bear in mind that as matters develop, continually reevaluate whether there are circumstances, for example, that potentially may suggest that a notification to DNO insurers is appropriate. So whilst I have given a high level reference to certainly 3 matters, 3 class actions that have been listed, there are a significant number of other matters that have resulted in notifications to insurers that are not in the public domain. So do just be mindful of potential issues as they develop and whether or not they should be notified to insurers. And if in doubt, then please do reach out to the brokers and ask for some guidance as to whether or not the circumstance that you're concerned about would constitute a circumstance under a DNO policy.
Thank you, Beth. That was hugely insightful. So just conscious that we're running up to our time limit. So just to conclude, it's been our pleasure to host you, and yeah, thank you for taking time out of the daily round of Zoom and conference calls to listen and participate today. A massive thanks as well goes out to our panelists today for providing their insights and practical thoughts to aid your C19 strategies and actions. We will be sending out a copy of today's presentation to all those that registered and attended, so please do not hesitate to reach out to your Marsh representative for any questions or concerns you may have as you continue to manage the impacts of the C19 crisis. And just to wrap up, for more information and resources to aid in your response to the current outbreak, we urge you to visit our C19 resource hub on marsh.com. Here you will find our current thought leadership offering, solutions and advice. And you can also stay up to date on Marsh News by following Marsh Global on Twitter. Our best wishes go to you and your families. Take care and stay safe.